Tim, I have a kind of schizophrenia. On the one hand, I was trained in brain science, and anything about the mind I can see is related to all these different brain structures. On the other hand, I've studied a great deal of the philosophy of consciousness, and there does seem to be very strong indication of the really special uniquenesses of consciousness that can't be totally explained by brain function as we know it. It's truly a schizophrenic reaction. So the way I ask the question is consciousness irreducible, or can it be explained entirely at some point in terms of physiology, brain function?
So, Robert, in asking that question, is consciousness irreducible, you mentioned that you sort of have a kind of schizophrenia here, and I share that ambivalence as to whether or not we should give a positive or a negative answer. You ask me this question, and on some days I'm going to give you one answer, and on other days I'll give you a different answer.
Well, let me hear the two different Tims. How would you give me one answer, and how would you give me another?
Sure. So here is, let me start with the case for a negative answer. So consciousness is irreducible. Let me give you the case for that. Take the contrast between notion of consciousness and something like intelligence, or any other notion where we think we've got the promise of a reduction. Mm-hmm. There you start with a functional analysis of the notion. It's normally what we start with in some level. You say, well, what is intelligence? Well, being able to answer questions, being able to behave in what, as one says, in an intelligent manner. And then you look for the mechanisms that realize that implement that. So you've got the brain structures, the computational structures, the brain structures, the algorithms. And once you've got all that in place, the thought is you can just see, it should be transparent to you that this creature, any creature that had those implementation mechanisms would be intelligent. And if it didn't, then it wouldn't be intelligent.
And even computers, non-biological intelligence, could pass some of those tests.
That's right. And we know that computers can't pass all of the tests, but we have promissory notes.
Not yet.
Not yet, yeah. But we sort of think in principle, why not? Mm-hmm. The contrast with consciousness is stark. Even if I know all there is to know about the neural machinery that underlies consciousness, the computational machinery, there still seems to be, as J.L. Austin, I think, wants to put it, a frog staring up at us from the bottom of the beer mug. There's something there that doesn't go away. There's a residue. Why should it be something it's like? Why should subjectivity be associated with that creature? Why should the phenomenal character of our experience be like this rather than like that? This is what Joe Levine and others have called the explanatory gap. And your classic cases of scientific reduction of water, of life, all these other notions don't seem to exhibit this gappiness. Once you've got the information at the bottom, that still doesn't seem to explain why the information about consciousness should be there, why this creature should be conscious in the way it is. So the question is whether there is an explanatory gap, as Levine puts it, between the neural substrate of consciousness, the brain. We know that there's correlations, but correlations don't get you reducibility. Correlations just get you correlations. The question is whether there's an explanatory gap between the neural correlates, the neural basis of consciousness and consciousness. And as I put it just before, whether there's a transparency between the properties of the brain and the properties of consciousness. And it doesn't look like there is. So that's why I worry that we're not going to get reducibility. That's why I'm inclined to think there's a kind of irreducibility that's in the offing, and a strong case can be made for that. Let me play the other side. Let me give you why I think we may get a partial reducibility. When we talk about consciousness, we focus on particular contents of consciousness, the red of the rose, the smell of the cheese, and the like. But consciousness has other aspects, other elements, other components. These are, and an important other aspect of consciousness is called the levels of consciousness. Some people call this the background states of consciousness. So you and I are both awake. We're in a normal clear state of consciousness. But if we were delirious, we would have what the clinicians call clouded consciousness. We would be confused. If we were hypnotized, we might be in another global disordered state of consciousness. If we were in a minimally conscious state, if we just emerged from a vegetative state and we were barely conscious, we might have perceptual experiences, but we wouldn't be capable of conscious thought and conscious deliberation. So in the literature, especially the clinical literature, people talk about levels of consciousness, dreaming. REM dreaming is another.
Some people with states of consciousness.
Some people talk about states, and so the scientists talk about states versus contents. Philosophers call the contents fine-grained states, and then they need another word, so they talk about background states. It's a mess. The terminology is a mess here. But it's very plausible, I think, that we are going to get something like a reduction of the levels of consciousness, or the states of consciousness. We know a lot about the neural mechanisms that are involved in modulating these general background states of arousal. So there's a lot of work on arousal, and arousal is a key implementational notion for these levels of consciousness. It can go up and it can go down. So what makes the difference between being in this normal state of awareness that you and I are being awake, in a normal waking consciousness? What makes the difference between that, between being in a state of REM dreaming, between being hypnotized? We may be able to get a functional reduction of that. And that's an aspect of consciousness. So I'm optimistic that we'll get partial reductions. We'll get reductions of some components, some elements of consciousness. But we may not get a full reduction of the what it's likeness of red, the what it's likeness of particular contents.
But if you do that, effectively you don't have a pure reduction. So you can reduce 99.99 however much you want to do, but if you don't make that final jump, it's as if you've done nothing at all. Because then there is a residue.
There's a residue.
And then you have to ask, where does that residue come from?
And then you've got the difficult metaphysical questions. And those are challenging questions. You can adopt some kind of dualism, but I'm reluctant to go there simply because to me that sounds like simply an X saying that we don't know what it is. There's no research program there as far as I can see.
Almost by definition, it's hard to have a research program for
right.
dualism.
That's just another
What's
way.
another alternative?
Well, you might. I don't think there is another alternative in a sense in terms of research programs.
That's a fair answer.
I mean, I think this is why I think one has to be optimistic in some sense methodologically, because the only research programs we have are ones that work within our scientific tools. Now, it's possible that there's a nature of consciousness that those tools just can't get at. But in terms of what we do and how we go forward, if these are the only tools we have, then we have to use them. We have no other tools.